There are minerals the world calls ordinary, and then there is salt. For most people, it is only a pinch between fingers, scattered on food without thought. But the ancients treated it as a treasure equal to gold. Entire caravans crossed deserts to carry it. Wars were fought for control of mines and coasts. Temples sprinkled it across their thresholds, not as flavor, but as protection, a shield against corruption. When children were born, some cultures rubbed salt on their skin so that no spirit of decay could approach. Even language remembers. Salary was once the coin given to Roman soldiers in salt, for it preserved not only flesh, but also the empire's power. Yet hidden behind these fragments of history lies something deeper. Salt was never only about commerce. It was a map back to origins. Every drop of blood you carry is salted water, echo of the oceans where life was born. Within your tears, salt marks grief and also release. In sweat, it carries exhaustion and also cleansing. To ignore salt is to ignore the memory of creation itself. This is why sages once whispered that salt was eternal, because wherever it flowed, death could not fully enter. And it is precisely for this reason that its higher meaning was silenced, forbidden, dismissed as superstition, because to remember salt as sacred was to place healing back into your own hands, not in the hands of kings or priests. Imagine a monastery hidden in the mountains during the Middle Ages. Candles flicker in the cold stone halls. A monk kneels before a wooden table, grinding white crystals with slow, reverent gestures. He is not preparing food. He is preparing a ritual. With each grain, he murmurs a verse, believing that the vibration of the word will awaken the mineral. He sprinkles the powder in a circle around the sick, convinced that salt absorbs not only moisture, but also the heaviness of pain. Such scenes never made it into official chronicles. They lived in whispers, because any attempt to speak them aloud risked punishment, and yet the rituals survived, traveling secretly across continents until they reached us as fragments of folklore. Salt thrown over the shoulder, salt placed in corners of the house, salt scattered on graves. Small gestures, faint echoes of a knowledge that once stood whole. Pause for a moment and bring your attention inward. Feel your heartbeat. The rhythm that keeps you alive is carried through blood as red tide, salinity nearly identical to the sea. It is not coincidence. Your body is a memory of the ocean that bore you. To understand salt is to understand that you are not separate from the earth or its waters. This truth is simple, yet dangerous, because once a human recognizes their body as sacred ocean, the boundaries of fear begin to dissolve. That is why rulers preferred to reduce salt to mere commodity. It was safer to let people fight for bags of it than to let them realize that inside themselves they carried the sea. In the silence of your own room, have you ever noticed how a single crystal sparkles like frozen light? Hold it up, and you see the geometry of nature's intelligence, angles cut as if by invisible hands. Mystics once said that each salt crystal was a piece of eternity condensed, a seed of incorruptibility. If you place it on your tongue with awareness, something happens. First, the taste, sharp and alive, then the sensation of warmth spreading through nerves, then the recognition. This is not seasoning. This is element. Fire, water, air, earth, and salt, the fifth that binds the rest. Hidden, but always present. What you are about to hear in this audiobook isn't a manual of chemistry. It is an act of remembrance. You will walk through forgotten temples where salt was used to mark the sacred space. You will hear the voices of healers who trusted it more than medicine, because it spoke directly to the soul. You will be guided into your own body to feel how salt still moves in blood, in sweat, in tears, carrying stories your mind has long forgotten. And perhaps, by the end, you will never look at the white grains in your kitchen with the same indifference again. So let the journey begin here. Not in laboratories, not in dusty shelves of science, but in the intimate recognition of something ancient inside you. Salt was the first crystal of creation, the covenant between body and spirit, the guardian against decay, the reminder of the sea within. This is the forbidden secret of salt, the mineral that heals body and soul. You were never meant to forget it. And now, as you listen, it rises again from silence. Before salt was reduced to a white dust in glass jars, before it was stripped of its mystery and sold as a common commodity, it was revered as one of the oldest medicines of the earth. The earliest civilizations understood something we have forgotten: that salt is not merely a mineral, but a force that touches body, mind, and spirit alike. To recover this memory, we must walk back through the corridors of history, where salt once glowed as sacred. In the ancient temples of Egypt, salt was as precious as gold. Priests preparing for rituals would bathe in water mixed with salt before they dared to enter the sanctuaries of the gods. They believed that the crystals dissolved not only dust and sweat, but also the residue of unclean thoughts. Salt was placed inside the tombs of pharaohs, scattered among the amulets and treasures, because it was said to protect the soul in its voyage through the underworld. Even in the great scrolls of medicine attributed to Imhotep, references to salt appear again and again, not as seasoning, but as purifier, as the key that separated the sacred from the profane. Travel westward to the Mediterranean, and you encounter the Greeks. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, lived near the sea and watched fishermen wash their wounds with salt water. He observed how cuts healed faster, how infections receded, and he wrote of salt baths as therapy for the body and calm for the spirit. Yet even Hippocrates hinted that what salt did went beyond the physical. He wrote that it restored harmony, as if the body were an instrument that salt could retune. His words survived, but their deeper implications were quietly ignored, filed away as primitive metaphor when in fact they pointed to an ancient science. The Romans knew its value all too well. Their great road, the Via Salaria, was dedicated entirely to its transport. From the Adriatic coast, caravans moved white treasure inland, grain by grain shaping the fate of the empire. Roman soldiers received part of their pay in salt, which is why we still speak of a salary. But beyond economics, the Romans recognized salt as the very essence of loyalty and endurance. To share salt with another at the table was to seal unbreakable friendship. To betray one who had shared salt with you was seen as the darkest sin. At banquets, a bowl of salt was always placed at the center, not only to flavor food, but to remind all present that their gathering was protected by something incorruptible. As Christianity spread, salt became even more layered in meaning. Early Christians referred to themselves as the salt of the earth. They were meant to preserve truth as salt preserves flesh, to carry purity as salt carries clarity. In the early rites of baptism, a grain of salt was placed on the tongue of the initiate, a gesture that symbolized wisdom, incorruptibility, and eternal life. Holy water itself was incomplete without salt. To this day, some churches continue the tradition, mixing crystals into the font before blessing it. But over time, the mystical layers faded. What had once been seen as a direct channel of divine power was reduced to a faint echo in rituals. The true force of salt, to heal, to protect, to awaken, slipped into the shadows, carried on only in whispers and folklore. Meanwhile, in the East, salt shaped entire cultures. In China, records from 2,000 years ago describe emperors controlling salt as carefully as they controlled armies. They taxed it, monopolized it, not only because it preserved food, but because it preserved life. Yet Taoist masters saw beyond the empire's economic interest. For them, salt was crystallized yang energy, the condensed breath of heaven and earth. They used it in alchemical experiments, mixing it with herbs and metals in search of elixirs. Salt was believed to balance energies, to anchor the spirit in the body, to ward off demons that thrived in decay. To this day, in some rural villages of China, salt is still thrown into the fire during festivals as an offering, the crackle of crystals said to frighten away misfortune. In India, salt carried both political and spiritual weight. Ayurveda, the ancient system of medicine, classified salts by type, black, red, white, and taught that each influenced the doshas, the subtle energies governing health. Salt was said to improve digestion, to clear stagnation, but also to sharpen perception. In yogic traditions, salt was sprinkled around meditation spaces to keep the atmosphere pure so that the mind would not be disturbed by unseen forces. Centuries later, Gandhi would march to the sea to make his own salt as an act of defiance against colonial powers. His march was not only political. Symbolically, it declared that the mineral of the people belonged to the people, that no empire had the right to hoard the essence of life itself. Crossing oceans, you find salt again in Japan, where to this day sumo wrestlers cast handfuls of salt into the ring before combat. To outsiders it looks like superstition, but the act is purification. It is the continuation of a tradition older than the sport itself, a memory that wherever salt is present, corruption retreats. In Shinto shrines, salt is placed in little mounds at entrances, silent guardians that remind visitors that they are stepping onto sacred ground. In funeral rites, mourners returning home sprinkle salt at the threshold before entering, to ensure that the heaviness of death doesn't follow them inside. These customs are not accidents. They are fragments of a greater whole, evidence that across cultures, salt always carried the same resonance: protection, purification, preservation. Even the deserts tell the story. In the endless white of salt flats, under the sun that seems to erase all shadows, nomads would sit in meditation, gazing at the horizon until the line between earth and sky dissolved. They believed salt opened the inner vision, guiding travelers not only across land, but across the inner desert of the soul. Their maps were not drawn on parchment, but written in memory, and salt was their compass. Without it, both body and spirit lost direction. But wherever salt gave life, authorities also moved to control it. In medieval Europe, salt taxes crushed peasants while kings grew rich. To defy the monopoly was to risk prison or death. Yet in secret, healers and midwives continued to use it in ways the rulers did not sanction. They placed bowls of salt beneath beds to draw out illness. They mixed it with herbs to cleanse wounds when doctors demanded payment beyond reach. They taught children to throw a pinch over the shoulder to keep misfortune away. For this persistence, many were accused of witchcraft, burned or exiled, though their true crime was not sorcery, but independence. They carried knowledge that did not depend on institutions, knowledge simple, free, and powerful. Ask yourself why something so abundant, so necessary to every cell of the human body, became the subject of wars, monopolies, persecutions. The answer is simple. Salt could not be owned. It was too common to control, too essential to erase. So rulers changed its story. They reduced it to commerce, taxed it, stripped it of its mystical face, and left only the flavor. They wanted you to forget that each crystal is a fragment of the earth's memory, that inside it resides the power to cleanse, to heal, to awaken. And yet the memory lingers. In every culture, in every time, salt reappears as guardian, healer, preserver. The fragments whisper of a greater truth, a manuscript never fully written yet always alive. The background of salt is not history alone. It is lineage, a river of remembrance that flows beneath empires and religions. To stand at its shore is to realize that what you hold between two fingers is not seasoning, but scripture. It is a covenant with life itself. If you sit very still and listen under the noise of the day, the notifications, the traffic, the obligations, you may notice another sound, low and tidal, hidden behind your heartbeat. It is not music, and yet it rises and falls with a rhythm older than language. This is the undertow of your inner waters. Physicians will name it with numbers and charts, but before the numbers there is a simple fact the elders never forgot. Your life is carried by a saline river that never stops moving. The first rule of salt is not a rule at all. It is a remembrance. The body remembers the sea, and when it remembers, it returns to order. I learned this not in a laboratory, but on a winter afternoon in a small coastal hospital. A nurse named Mara rolled a cart past my chair. Clear bags swung from the metal pole like quiet moons, each labeled with a simple word that people glance at and forget. Saline. A patient with a dizziness that would not let him stand without falling was lying in a narrow bed, eyes shut against a spinning world. Mara lifted his wrist, found the vein, and in a few minutes of trickle and patience, the color came back to his face. He did not know the word for what happened. He only knew the floor returned to the place floors should be. I watched his breath change, shallow to steady, and I thought, even here, in the fluorescent light and the antiseptic smell, the cure was not exotic. It was a reminder. Salt water, balanced as the inner sea, asked his body to remember itself. Mara told me she had learned to listen for the moment when tension leaves a body. It is subtle, she said, like hearing a lock turn in a distant room. The shoulder softens first, then the throat, then the clenched hands unclasp without ceremony. I asked what she thinks about in those minutes. Nothing special, she said. I just imagine the tide going out and coming in. I imagine the body catching that rhythm again. It was an answer without doctrine, but it contained the entire chapter. The inner ocean has no ideology. It needs only space to move. I could give you explanations about ions and gradients. I could tell you that every thought you have is transmitted by the dance of salts moving across cell membranes. That the sodium-potassium pump is a gatekeeper cycling without rest, opening and closing like a gill, pulling the current that becomes attention, memory, choice. I could describe how a heart organizes its beat by the choreography of electrolytes, how a muscle lifts a life because salts know when to enter and when to leave. But explanations are maps. Before you trust them, you must feel the territory under your feet. So let us walk to another place. A salt marsh at dusk, the sky a bruised violet, reeds cutting murmurs into the wind. An old man who once was a fisherman waits by a narrow channel where the tide threads back toward the sea. He is not a healer by trade, but he knows what his hands know. A young woman arrives, her breath shallow, her chest tight in a way no test has managed to name. She has been given labels and pills and still wakes at night as if the room is shrinking. The old man does not ask for the story of her symptoms. He asks for the story of her days. What is heavy? Where did you stop singing? When did you start speaking to yourself in a voice that is not yours. Her answers spill like a small river finding a slope. When she is done, he brings a wooden bowl of warm water, dissolves a handful of coarse crystals, and says nothing. He places the bowl at her feet and tells her only to breathe with the outgoing tide. He has her imagine that each exhale carries a little more of the room's press into the water waiting at her toes. 15 minutes pass, then 20. When she steps out, the old man throws the water into the reeds. The marsh accepts the salt with a hiss you might miss if you were in a hurry. The woman's chest is not cured by a miracle. It is simply less defended. The body remembered the sea, not because it tasted brine on the tongue, but because the ritual gave it permission to stop bracing against a wave that never came. Some will say this is theater, that comfort comes from attention and not from the mineral. But attention is a current, and the mineral is a conductor. The point is not to argue, but to observe. When we bring salt to the margins of the body, the soles of the feet, the wrists, the rim of breath, we give the inner water a shape to recognize. The recognition is the medicine, not the superstition of crystals, not the superstition of ideas, but the moment of alignment when the body says, "Yes, that, I know that." There is a second scene I cannot forget. A pianist who had lost the will to touch her instrument sat across from me with hands that trembled in their own weather. She said her teacher's last words before he died had taken the sound out of the keys. She did not repeat the words. She did not need to. The room remembered them. I asked her what the sea sounded like in her childhood. She said the sea was not sound, but taste. Summers on a coast where the spray arrived like a whisper of knives. I asked her to bring a pinch of salt the next time we met. She did, a small cloth packet tied with blue thread. I dissolved the pinch in a glass, asked her to dip her fingers, then to place her damp fingertips on the keys without playing, only resting there, letting the wood drink what her skin offered. For a long minute, nothing happened but breath. Then she pressed a single note so softly, I felt more than heard it. Another minute, another note. When we finished, there was salt on the keys. She laughed, surprised and ashamed and relieved all at once. Did it cure anything? Cure is a word for battles. This was not a battle. This was recollection. The body, through the smallest possible ritual, remembered the sea and, with it, remembered that sound belongs to it again. This is why we find salt in tears at every border of human life. At births where joy burns too bright for skin. At funerals where a name becomes an empty chair. In kitchens where onions force memory to the surface. On cheeks when two people who feared they would never again belong to anyone fall into each other's arms. Emotional tears are not failures of control. They are saline declarations. Nothing rotten will be kept in this house. The body chooses salt to carry what words cannot carry. And when the body chooses salt, it chooses the sea's method: movement, dissolution, return. Do not mistake this chapter for a command to consume more salt. The lesson is not ingestion, but relation. To drown food in crystals is not reverence. To flood a body that already knows its range is not love. The secret is subtler and therefore more powerful. We are speaking of contact, of conscious thresholds, of the precise ways salt reminds without overwhelming. A pinch on the wrist before a difficult conversation. A shallow bowl beneath the bed to hold the heaviness of a grief you are not ready to name. A bath that is not a spa advertisement, but a quiet half-hour with the door locked, the light low, a handful of salt dissolving while you count the inhales like stepping stones across a dark stream. These acts are not decorations. They are messages to the inner ocean. You may flow here. it is tempting to ask for proofs more glamorous than stories, to demand a randomized trial for the efficacy of a grandmother's bowl by the bedside. But we forget that much of what keeps us alive, trust, attention, the steadiness of someone breathing near us through a long night, has never fit easily inside a study design. Science, when it is honest, does not shy away from what it cannot yet measure. It names the edges and keeps walking. The ancients, when they were honest, did not claim thunderbolts from their rituals. They claimed continuity. Salt offered continuity. It preserved food against time, yes, but it also preserved a person against the small corruptions of daily fear. Place a grain on the tongue before speaking a truth that may cost you something, and the truth will taste like the ocean that taught you to be born. A pilgrim once told me about a road that crosses a salt lake so white it hurts to keep your eyes open. Each year he walks out to the middle with nothing to do there, no shrine, no cairn, no relic to touch. He stands where there is no shade and says his mother's name and his father's name and the names of the ones he loved and the names of the ones he betrayed. And then he stands in the silence until the names become the simplest breath. He returns with cracked lips and a face peeled by light, and still he goes again the next year. He said the salt teaches him that the soul does not die from exposure, it dies from stagnation. Out there, he cannot hoard, cannot decorate, cannot distract. He can only remember, and the remembering empties him of what he no longer needs. All through this chapter, I have used the word remember. It is not nostalgia. Nostalgia is a museum you visit when you are tired of the present. Remembrance is a function, like the way a compass discloses north, or a seed discloses what kind of tree it holds. When the body remembers the sea, it does not daydream about beaches. It reestablishes a law. Water moves and movement cleans. The lymph finds its root. The breath finds the low place in the ribs that hasn't opened in months. The mind stops arguing with the air. The jaw unclenches as if a sentence you were about to say has already been heard by a listener who never interrupts. There is a final scene I want to leave in your hands. A woman in a city far from any coast kept waking at 3:13 a.m., her chest clenched as if a story was trapped between the fourth and fifth ribs. She had tried every app and every bedtime tea. She had stopped coffee and started gratitude journals. The hour still came like a knock she could not refuse. On the night she decided to do something foolish, she filled a basin with warm water and dissolved a spoon of salt and set it on the windowsill. When the hour came, she did not fight. She placed her palms in the basin and whispered nothing. 10 minutes later, her hands were pruned, and a small laughter rose in her throat. Not because anything had been fixed, but because the knock had turned into the hum of a refrigerator in another room. She dried her hands, left the basin where it was, and slept. The next night she woke again, but now there was a ritual waiting for her, and the ritual transformed waking into practice. A month later she still woke sometimes, and still she placed her palms in the water, and still the body remembered without her needing to force it. She did not call this healing. She called it permission. I call it the same. Salt permitted the sea to return to its work. You do not need a priest of the old temples or a prescription from a modern clinic to begin this remembering. You need a pinch of humility and a willingness to be ridiculous in a world that worships only what can be photographed. You need to approach salt as if approaching an elder whose language you are learning. You do not ask grand questions. You ask for a syllable, and then you listen for the echo inside your chest. Over time, syllables become words. The inner ocean begins to answer in full sentences. The body returns to its grammar. And when the grammar is restored, Life speaks through you with less static and more truth. If you ask what this principle offers beyond the solace of imagery, I will say it offers coordination. When the inner waters move, separate parts of you begin to keep time with one another. The thought that frightened your breath into a corner meets the warmth that loosens your diaphragm. The memory you tried to out-argue meets the salt that carries it into the bowl. The fatigue that wrapped your shoulders like wet cloth meets the tide that wrings it out without accusation. Coordination is not fireworks. It is a steadiness you can build a year on. So take this chapter as an invitation to practice remembering in the smallest ways. Wet your fingers and touch the inside of your wrists before you pick up the phone to make a call you fear. Dissolve a pinch of salt in a glass and, instead of drinking, tip a little over the threshold you cross each evening when you return home from the noise of work. Place a grain on your tongue with the same attention you would give a vow. Do not expect a trumpet. Expect a door to open somewhere deep enough that you may not hear the hinge, only the new air. The secret was never that salt holds magic tricks. The secret is that you do. Salt is how you remind yourself, and in a world built to keep you forgetting, any faithful method of remembrance will look like rebellion. Let it be. The rebellion is gentle. The rebellion is a bowl of warm water and a patient exhale, and a willingness to let something older than your worry speak first. The body remembers the sea. When it forgets, fear grows barnacles on the ribs, and the voice goes hoarse from calling for help no one else knows how to give. When it remembers, the barnacles release their grip and fall of their own weight. You do not need to scrape. You need to tide. Let the tide work. Let the salt teach. Let the inner ocean do what oceans do when they are given back their shore. There are thresholds the world can see. Door frames, window sills, the edge of a path where gravel becomes grass. And then there are thresholds no one notices until they are crossed. The moment after a harsh sentence leaves the mouth. The first breath in a house someone you loved has just left. The hour when you return from a hospital and silence clings to your clothes like frost. Purification is for thresholds, and salt is the simplest guardian you can carry between your fingers. The second principle is not a sermon about being spotless. It is the plain art of clearing what is not yours, so that what is truly yours can remain. A woman I knew moved into an apartment that looked harmless in daylight and heavy at night. It was not the kind of heaviness you can photograph. The hallway bulbs burned a steady amber. The floorboards were clean. Yet every time she stepped through the door, something of her voice dimmed. She began leaving the television on while she cooked, though she didn't watch it. She only needed the noise to keep a quieter noise from gathering. One evening, tired of being a guest in her own rooms, she made a line of salt along the inside of the threshold, not as a dare to darkness, but as an introduction. She spoke softly to it the way you speak to a sleeping child, naming room by room what the line would guard. The stove, where she wanted food to taste like laughter, the corner where she would read, the window where morning arrived first. When she finished, nothing visible had changed, yet the air felt as if a window had been opened in another part of the building. For weeks, she swept and relaid the line after visitors left, not from fear of them, but because people bring weather. The salt met the weather and metabolized it. The apartment learned her name. Customs like this will be waved away as superstition by anyone who has never come home from a day that stains. But purification is older than argument. It lives in gestures passed hand to hand. Bread dipped in salt to begin a sacred meal. Mounds of white salt flanking shrine gates. so that whatever enters remembers to bow. Small saucers of salt set outside shop doors at dawn because prosperity prefers clean thresholds. In some houses, a pinch of salt rests on the family photograph so that envy will slide off the glass. In others, a line is drawn on the sill after a difficult visitor leaves, then swept into the street an hour later. Long enough to cool, not long enough to become a wall. These are not decorations. They are agreements between a person and a space. I met a potter who spoke about salt with the candor of someone who has burned it. In his kiln, a handful of salt transforms the surface of clay into glass, a vapor glaze born from sodium meeting heat and sand. He told me that after a betrayal, he could not stand in his studio without feeling grit under his tongue, though the floor was spotless. He started closing each day by dissolving salt in a bucket, dragging a cotton mop in slow circles, not to sterilize but to redraw the room. He swore the light changed. He swore the clay stopped cracking as if a sentence against him had been lifted. Clay responds to mineral and heat. Why should a body be stranger than clay? There is the body of the house, there is the body of the breath. Purification touches both. If you have ever gargled warm, salted water when your throat was raw, you know the simple relief of seeing clouded phlegm leave and the sound of your voice return to its register. That is not glamour. That is exit. Salt does not plead with the heaviness to be kinder. It escorts it to the door. A singer I know keeps a small jar of coarse crystals in her dressing room. Before rehearsal, she dissolves a pinch, takes 2 mouthfuls, and lets them fall into a bowl, as if returning a debt. When she steps onto the stage, her voice does not shine by miracle. It shines because the room inside her has been swept. In a Highland town that receives more funerals than weddings, a midwife keeps a blue bowl beside her bed. After a birth, she fills the bowl with warm water and salt, dips her hands until her joints stop echoing with the push and tremor of another person's hour. She says her job is to hold doors open and to stand aside while life decides how to walk through them. The bowl is the door for what must not follow her home. She sleeps when her hands forget the names they held. She wakes when her hands are hands again. No one pays her for this. No one needs to. Salt is cheap and sovereign. You can tell a great deal about a people by how they preserve food. Where there is fear of famine, there is mastery of brine. A cabbage leaf drowned in salted water stops rotting and begins to become itself in a new key. Fish salted at the dock will still taste of a shoreline a winter from now. Meat cured with salt can outlast weather. On the surface, this is chemistry, osmotic gradients, moisture drawn out where bacteria would prefer it left alone. Beneath the surface, it is philosophy. What do you choose to keep, and how do you keep it alive without embalming it? Purification is not bleach. It is balance. The same mineral that keeps mold from a barrel of cucumbers keeps envy from a table. The same clarity that makes a broth savory makes a room more truthful. When I worked nights in a ward where machines sang unkind lullabies, I learned to wash the day off before it learned my name. There was no ritual kit, only a chipped sink and a paper cup. I would fill the cup, shake a packet of salt into it, and let the water run over my wrists. Sometimes I could smell the metal in the tap, sometimes not. Either way, the crystals found the place in me that did not want to go home with me. I would tip the cup into the drain and think of rivers that never get credit for what they carry away. On the nights I forgot, the hallway followed me into the elevator, into the car, into the kitchen where my keys landed too hard on the table. On the nights I remembered, the stove flame looked like a flame, and not a diagnosis coated in orange. In the lowlands where fog moves like an animal that does not answer to human clocks, lighthouse keepers used to scatter salt at the base of the tower after storms. They said it kept the salt that mattered from turning to rust. An odd sentence until you stand a few hours in a room where dampness seeps into paper, into wool, into temper. The keeper who told me this had hands like driftwood and a laugh that sounded like rope uncoiling. He said the line he poured was less about the floor than about the air. He liked to hear the tiny crack of crystals under his boot as he climbed, not because he enjoyed breaking anything, but because the sound told him there was still edge in a world that had blurred overnight. You may wonder how far to go with all of this. How much salt? How often? How to dispose of what has absorbed? There are no commandments here, only courtesies. Use enough to feel a boundary under your palm. Not so much that you turn your house into a field after snow. Sweep what you have used into a paper and give it back to a place that knows endings. A trash bag you will tie soon, a garden where rain will come, a curb where street sweepers pass at dawn. Do not hoard used salt on a shelf, imagining it will continue to work while you forget to speak to it. It has taken on a task. Thank it and let it go. The point is not to decorate your life with rituals. The point is to relieve your life of residues that rituals know how to carry. A friend who writes apologies for a living, speeches spoken by mouths that did not write them, keeps a habit I found almost comical until I tried it. When a sentence must be said that acknowledges harm, he places a single grain of salt on his tongue before he begins. He wants his mouth to remember the difference between disinfectant and poison. Words meant to cleanse should sting and then soothe. Words meant to wound burn without healing. He says the grain reminds his tongue to choose the first and not the second. Does it change the world? Perhaps not in units fit for graphs. But I have read his sentences, and they break less than most. In some cities, markets sell cones of salt dyed with turmeric, others with indigo. People buy them not for flavor, but for color, a small sun or a small night to set by the door for 7 days. When the week ends, the cone is broken into a bowl, water is poured, and the mixture is fed to a tree. A woman explained to me that yellow eats the complaints she cannot speak at work. Blue drinks the glances she does not want to remember. She did not sound like a poet. She sounded like a person who had decided to be free in the smallest reliable ways. The tree seemed to agree. Purification must be gentle, or it becomes another kind of violence. You cannot scrub shame out of a wall with a brush and a shout. You can, however, name what happened in that room, open a window, and set a small plate of salt on the sill so that the first new air has a partner in the work. The plate will collect dew at night. In the morning it will crust. That crust is beautiful if you let it be, a frost that belongs to summer. Break it and begin again. No whips, no vows, only continuance. Geologists write of salt domes, great columns of ancient salt rising slowly through heavier rock until they bulge the ground above into soft hills. In some of those hills we have carved cathedrals of darkness and air, chambers where guided tours talk about miners and lamps. Stand in such a chamber long enough without narration, and you will feel what the lungs feel when air has been taught to hold still for 1,000 years. People go to these places to breathe, and they pay money for the privilege. This is not odd. It is recognition. Salt, whether crushed underfoot or layered above your head in a silent dome, enacts a single promise. It will not side with rot. I do not claim salt will save you from grief, nor that it will absolve your debts. Purification is not absolution. It is permission to begin. After you have told the truth to someone who deserved it years ago, Rinse your hands over a bowl with a pinch of salt and watch the water go cloudy. You are not washing away blame. You are washing away the static your body held in order to say the words. After you return from a room where machines chatter about mortality, scatter salt on the welcome mat and sweep it off with your shoe. You are not controlling fate. You are reminding the place where you live that it can trust you to arrive as yourself. There is a child I once watched carry a shaker to the porch after a fight had left a mean echo in the house. Without instructions, he drew a circle around his bare feet and stood inside it, humming to himself. He stayed until the humming sounded like humming and not like crying pretending to be a song. Then he kicked the circle into a bright mess and went back inside for dinner. No one had taught him that. Someone had taught him to listen. The second principle is as clear as the crystals you can hold. Salt purifies. Not by hatred of dirt, but by love of shape. It does not exile what is dark. It gives darkness a path out. It does not punish the air for having carried shouts. It invites the air to carry something else. Wherever you place it with attention, on the threshold, on the tongue, in a bowl under the bed where dreams bring home weather from far places, salt takes in what would otherwise cling and returns it to the world in a form that no longer needs a name. Practice lightly. Practice often. Practice with the smallest amounts until your rooms and your breath begin to tell you where and when. And when a day comes that cannot be cleaned by any mineral, sit without salt and know that still the knowledge is yours. You will know when to pick it up again. This is the forbidden ordinary of purification, that a thing so common can be so faithful that you do not need more than a pinch to make a room remember its work. That all along, the threshold waited for a hand to draw a line on it, not to divide the world into pure and impure, but to say to what hurts and lingers, you may stop here. There are promises we sign with ink, and others we sign with breath. Ink fades and paper tears. Breath returns to the mouth that spoke it and disappears. But there is a third way, older than parchment and more faithful than wind. It is the way of salt. Beyond the remembrance of our inner ocean, and beyond the cleansing of thresholds, salt bears the gravity of covenant. A covenant is not merely an agreement, it is a bond that the earth itself recognizes. Humans discovered, long before treaties and seals and courts, that when a vow passes through salt, it gains a body. It resists decay as the mineral resists corruption. It survives our weakness the way a preserved harvest survives winter. I learned this not from books, but from nights in places where the only law that mattered was the law you could keep. In the desert, people say that words are wind and salt is memory. I once sat in a tent while a storm wrote its anger on the canvas. Two men, enemies for years, faced each other across a low tray where bread, dates, and a small bowl of coarse crystals waited. The elder tore the bread, pressed it into the white, and placed half into the other man's hand. They ate in silence. There was no speech to bless the moment, no flourish of witness, only chewing and breathing and the quiet certainty that the world had shifted. The next morning armed riders arrived, demanding that one be surrendered. The elder walked into the daylight with the dust of the storm still in his beard and said, "He has eaten of my salt." The riders argued, threatened, pleaded. He did not raise his voice. He only repeated the sentence until they understood that they were not arguing with a man but with the desert's memory. They left. Years later, when I asked him whether he had feared the consequences of defiance, he smiled and said, "Fear has no salt." Far away in the Balkans, covenant takes a different shape but the same taste. I watched two men become brothers on a winter evening when the fields were stone and the roofs wore spears of ice. An old woman placed a bowl between them and made the sign of a circle in the air. They broke bread and dipped it in salt. They looked at each other with the solemn expression of people who know that life can turn strangers into kin or kin into strangers with equal ease. When they swallowed, the room exhaled. The old woman, who had buried a husband and 3 sons and still moved with the grace of someone who believed in seasons, said to me, "Blood can be spilled by an accident, but salt is never an accident." In that village, they say a man who betrays a salt brother begins to cough and never fully stops. You may call it superstition. They call it the body refusing to digest treachery. In Ethiopia, the sting of covenant is placed directly on the tongue. At weddings, I have seen couples rest crystals on each other's lips before they share their first meal as husband and wife. The sting is part of the promise. Sweetness alone cannot be trusted. Sweetness rots when left to itself. Salt preserves sweetness the way it preserves meat against summer. Years later, when quarrels rise like storms that know the door code, they take out a small pouch of their wedding salt, touch the grains, and let the memory of that first sting pull them back to the shore. One woman showed me her pouch after 50 years. The leather was cracked and the crystals had yellowed at the edges, but she held them like holy relics. "We were not always kind," she said, "but the salt never forgot for us." Religion understood this instinct long before theology chased language into books. In the early centuries, a grain of salt touched the tongue of a child at baptism, while the priest whispered of wisdom and incorruptibility. Holy water itself was salted, because water without salt is incomplete in the old imagination, too easily stolen by whatever corruption stands near. Even where the ritual has faded, the echo remains in houses where a pinch of crystal sleeps in pockets against nightmares, where a saucer sits by the door, bright as a small moon, reminding anyone who enters that not every heaviness is welcome. There are other covenants that salt keeps, quieter and more solitary. A man once told me about his months in captivity. He had neither calendar nor clock, only a sliver of window high on a wall that sometimes admitted a square of sky. When guards tossed him scraps of salted fish, he learned to hide a single grain beneath his tongue. He vowed that as long as he could taste salt, he would not allow his mind to step off the ledge into the dark. When temptation to surrender arrived like a soft voice speaking through the keyhole, he pressed the grain against his teeth and remembered a table he once set for his daughters on a summer evening: the bowl of tomatoes, the loaf of bread, the salt shining like frost. He survived. "It wasn't nourishment," he said when he could finally tell the story. "It was covenant. The earth kept me when no one else could." Walk to the edge of a salt marsh, and you will see another kind of vow. In Brittany, the pollutier, the salt worker, draws thin rakes through shallow pans where the ocean lies down to evaporate. The first crystals, delicate as lace, are called the flower. The worker harvests them with a wooden paddle that moves like a prayer. Each season he begins by returning a handful to the sea and speaking aloud, though no one stands near, his promise to take only what the water freely gives. He will leave enough for the tide to continue its work. He told me the sea remembers who keeps promises and who steals. In years when storms tore neighboring pans apart, his pools held. He shrugged when I called it luck. "It is a ledger," he said. "Salt keeps accounts better than we do. Covenant enters laboratories too, though scientists are trained to avoid such words. I know a researcher who spent long nights staring into a microscope at cubes so perfect they felt like a rebuke to fatigue. Sodium races toward water in a fever, chlorine chokes breath away. Together they lay down their violence and become something life must have. He told me that the first time he understood the lattice, he stepped back on his stool and laughed, not from humor but from relief, as if the world had given him a proof that reconciliation is not a fairy tale. Opposites can bind, he said. Look, they build cathedrals in there. He was not a man who prayed, but he kept a small dish of crystals on his desk after that, and when his marriage staggered, he salted the letter he wrote to his wife with 1 tear and 1 grain, and sent it anyway. I have seen covenant at the lip of a cliff monastery where prayer flags snap in winds that never rest. Novices there touch crystals to their tongues before they make their first vows. The abbot tells them that the sting is a reminder that vows must be tasted, not merely spoken, and that salt carries them across winters when the mouth forgets. One novice confided that whenever doubt visited like a fox at dusk, he would return to the kitchen, lift the lid of a jar, and touch 1 grain to his mouth. He said he could feel the vow move through him like a small light learning how to lengthen. But a covenant is not a spectacle. It is a way of being faithful to yourself in practices so small the world will miss them. You can begin tonight with a glass of water, a pinch of salt, and a promise, you mean. Rest your hands on the table. Let the lights be low. Stir the crystals until the water clears, and speak a sentence you intend to keep. It must be modest enough that your body does not flinch, true enough that your soul does not turn its face away. Dip your fingertips and touch your lips, as if you are sealing the words not just with sound but with substance. Feel the brief sting on the tender skin. Then sit for a minute and listen for the echo inside the chest. Later, when you are tempted to fail, it will be the skin that remembers first, and the memory will buy you time to choose again. You can salt a threshold too when you are ready to return to a place as someone new. Draw a thin line across the floor with the edge of your palm. Stand before it and say, quietly enough that only the salt and the air hear, the person you intend to be on the other side. Step over. Sweep the line into a folded paper and carry it to soil or water. Covenant prefers motion to hoarding. It asks that you return what has served you to a place that knows how to dissolve it without residue. I once guided a circle of people who had come because words alone had failed them. Each wrote a vow on paper and sprinkled it with a pinch of salt. We folded the pages, dipped them quickly into a bowl so that the crystals melted into the fibers, and pressed them between clean cloth. The room smelled faintly of sea and ink. No one spoke for several minutes. When they finally did, voices were lower, slower, less theatrical. Months later, notes came back. A father had moved out of a rage and into a quieter house inside himself. A teacher returned to the joy of her work after years of exhaustion. A son wrote that he had forgiven a debt and slept through the night for the first time since the debt was made. They credited the ritual, but I think it was the covenant. The salt had given their words a body tough enough to survive ordinary failure. It is important to say this plainly. Covenant doesn't prevent falling. It prevents disintegration. A marriage salted at its birth will still endure storms, but the bond will not rot while the weather passes. A friendship salted with ritual can stretch across years of absence and remain unspoiled. A vow salted with intention may bend under weight, but will not dissolve in the first rain. Salt does not flatter us into grandiosity. It teaches us to keep time with something steadier than mood. Think for a moment about the promises you have broken and why. Often it was not malice, but erosion. Days wore at the edges until nothing fit. Salt is the simple resistance to that wearing. It is the force that says to the day, "You may touch this, but you may not take it." And when you have failed, as every human must, salt offers a way to begin again without the rot of shame. You can reseal a vow. You can salt a scar. The first sting will feel like reproach, and then, almost immediately, like relief. I have kept a small, lidded jar on my desk for years. When a sentence matters, I open it and touch a grain to my tongue before I write. When a conversation matters, I do the same before I dial. When someone brings me a promise and asks if I think they can keep it, I do not hand them advice. I hand them the jar. They smile, confused, and then they taste. Most of the time, the smile returns in another shape. They say, "It's so simple," I say. "That is why it works." Complexity has its place in machines and theories. Covenant prefers elements. This, finally, is the forbidden heart of the matter. A people who know how to bind their lives with salt are not easily ruled by fear or by fashion. Their vows do not rely on spectacle or on institutions to hold them. They do not need an audience to mean what they say. This kind of independence worries every empire and every industry that profits from forgetfulness. It is safer to sell us complicated systems than to let us keep a jar in the kitchen and a ritual in the throat. It is safer to laugh at what is ordinary than to admit that ordinary things have always been the carriers of what lasts. So remember what the elder in the desert knew, what the grandmother in the mountain kitchen knew, what the prisoner with a single grain under his tongue knew, what the salt worker at the marsh and the scientist at the microscope, both discovered by different roads. Salt is not merely a taste. It is a witness. When you let it pass through your promise, the earth hears you. When you let it touch your lips, the soul signs with the body. When you offer it back to water or soil, you acknowledge that covenants are living things that breathe with the world and not possessions to hide in drawers. Hold a grain between finger and thumb. See how it catches the light. Consider how many winters a cellar full of salted harvests has carried a family across, and then consider how many winters a salted vow might carry you. You do not need a ceremony that requires permission. You do not need a vocabulary that scares you away from your own sincerity. You need only to speak, to taste, to return what remains when the speaking is done. In this way, you enter a lineage older than kingdoms, a chain of covenants that resisted fire and flood by doing what salt always does. It refused to rot. The third revelation stands without trumpets. Salt is covenant, between strangers who sit together at a low table while the wind claws at the fabric of the world, between lovers who accept the necessary sting so that sweetness can survive, between the body and the soul, each time a grain touches the tongue and memory stands up inside the flesh, between the one who promises and the earth that agrees to hold the promise until the promiser is able. Taste it, and you will feel how time itself becomes more trustworthy. You have walked with me through 3 revelations. The first was remembrance. Salt awakens the body to the sea it still carries inside, reminding every cell that it was born from water and light. The second was purification. Salt clears the thresholds of body and space, escorting heaviness away without argument, making room for what is true. The third was covenant. Salt binds promises to flesh and to earth, preserving them against the erosion of forgetfulness. These are not metaphors alone. They are practices hidden in plain sight, disguised as seasoning on your table, disguised as superstition in your grandmother's gestures, disguised as routine in the saline bags of a hospital. To dismiss them as trivial is to miss that the ordinary has always been the carrier of the sacred. Salt is the mineral of memory, of clarity, of vow. It is the earth's way of saying, what matters can endure. When you leave this listening, I ask you to do one small act. Do not make it grand, do not make it heavy. Simply take a grain between your fingers, hold it to the light, and acknowledge that you are holding a fragment of the covenant that has preserved life for millennia. Place it on your tongue with attention. Taste the sting, let it linger, and whisper a promise to yourself, however modest. The promise may be to rest, to forgive, to remember, or simply to breathe with less haste. Let the salt bear witness. Return what remains to water or to soil. You will feel a shift, not thunder, not lightning, but the steady hum of continuity. This has been the forbidden manuscript of salt, the mineral that heals body and soul. Forbidden not because it is dangerous, but because it is simple, and simplicity is the greatest threat to powers that prefer us dependent, distracted, and forgetful. You now know what generations risked to carry forward in secret, that healing, cleansing, and covenant are not luxuries bought from others but inheritances already in your hands. So walk with this knowledge. Season your food, yes, but also season your days. Remember the ocean in your blood. Clear the thresholds of your rooms. Salt your vows so that they endure. And when you do, you are not merely practicing tradition. You are participating in eternity.